So welcome to this second session on maths and truth and Christian faith. And we're reminded in the first session that maths has a certain beauty and consistency about it, an invisibility about it that points to more going on than just the numbers. Unlike Aristotle, who says that it's the ideas that are made up in humans' minds and seen when people do things, maths appears to have a reality that goes beyond this, which Plato said it pointed to activity in the mind of God. And many mathematicians have also said that. One outstanding mathematician who said that was Gödel, with his incompleteness theorem, in which Kurt Gödel, in his conversations with Albert Einstein, argued that the beauty of maths and the proofs of maths point to much more going on, and they show us something about the mind of God. And Albert Einstein appears to have in many ways agreed with the beauty that's in maths, pointing to the mind of God and the way God does things. So maths, even though it often seems to be man-made, and students may think, hey, these are just the way the teacher or people are putting numbers together, has much more going on. And it is an area that you can explore and you can discover much more of. And the history of maths tells us something about that. So maths and Christian faith have a connection, and Plato argued in some of the earliest theories regarding patterns in nature that there appears to be much, much more going on. Fibonacci. Now, hands up those who've come across Fibonacci and the Fibonacci sequence before, where you see spirals and patterns in nature. So Gabriel, then Ruben, what can you tell us about Fibonacci and his observations of patterns in nature?
Look, I'm not going to lie to you. I know the Fibonacci sequence because of the Fibonacci version of the game 2048. I haven't actually done any research. It was just a game that I played on Cool Maths Games as a kid when I didn't want to focus in class. So take from that what you will, Dr. Sam. Go wild.
That's good. Ruben, tell us what stands out to you about Fibonacci.
Yeah, well, isn't it that the number is added to the number before it in the sequence? So you have 1 and 1, and then eventually it goes to 1 plus 1, which is 2. And then you have 2 plus 1 is 3, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so that's pretty much what we did for it.
Now,
what do I know about it?
Interestingly, just like the number 2 plus 2 equals 4, it seems to be out there as a real thing. Fibonacci's sequence appears to be out there in the natural world. That is, if you look at, you got 2 rabbits, they have a baby, you got 3, and then 3 plus 2 makes 5 rabbits. You could look at breeding of animals, but when you look at plants, you see that there's a beauty to it. If you were to start with a square, 1 plus 1, and add another 1 plus 1 square, you'd have a 2 plus 2 if you double it. And then if you add 3 and 2, you would have a square. This is the way a spiral forms. But in nature, shells, storms, flowers, they use this adding of the number before it in order to make many of the natural things in nature. So Leonardo Fibonacci in the Middle Ages was thinking about these things in 1170, and in his education, he wrote a geometry textbook that developed Euclid's ideas further, and he uses the Indo-Arabic number system as well. And so he develops these ideas that have a certain beauty about them. And so he applies it to the breeding of rabbits, and then he applies it to the beauty in the natural world. And then he applies it to develop the golden ratio, or the perfect shape. So if you add the shapes together, you end up with a rectangle that is very pleasing. And 1,000 years before Fibonacci, the ancient Greeks have been doing this when they built temples, in that the temple would then have this shape to it, which is said to be the most perfect shape. But Leonardo da Vinci uses this in his engineering, but he also uses this when he does paintings. Michelangelo does the same, because in the natural world all around them, they can observe that natural plants are using the Fibonacci sequence in order to develop the plants. We see this in the number of petals: 1 petal, 2 petal, 3 petal, 5 petal. Plants are using Fibonacci numbers all the way through. We also see other geometric patterns in nature, which some say also point to the language of God. So this is another example of there appear to be patterns in nature that are that point to much more going on. Eugene Wigner, winner of the Nobel Prize of Physics in 1963, wrote an essay, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Maths in Natural Science, in which he says, it is so beautiful, so predictable, so concise, that there appears to be a connection between maths and physics and faith in God. The enormous usefulness of mathematics in natural science borders on the mysterious. There's no rational explanation for it apart from there is a designer. It's like finding a watch in a field and saying that someone made it, or finding a house and saying that there was a architect who designed the house. Those who do not know mathematics, they often don't appreciate the beauty of the numbers. Kepler said the laws of nature have such a beauty, they reflect the mathematical thoughts of God. And Colossians tells us similarly, the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. He created all things. And so many have seen this pattern that's in the world that points to God. So Kurt Gödel, in discussing with Albert Einstein the beauty of the natural world, argued that these mathematical numbers point to God. And so Gödel's God reflects the beauty that is there in maths that is all around us. John Lennox says that over 60% of Nobel Prize winners believe in God because it's the beauty that they see in maths that points to God. So all around us in the natural world, there appear to be evidence of God. And even if you look at chance, Poitras in his book, Chance and the Sovereignty of God, argues that God and science are enemies. The chance is simply not explaining all that is going on. He argues that mathematical laws, if they're properly understood and relied upon, show us something about truth that's everywhere, that's always, that cannot be defeated, that it's rational. These are characteristics of God himself, who creates the maths that's in our world. So Poitras says, chance is not chaos, it's simply missing knowledge. Can I ask Ruben, what are your thoughts on these ideas?
So specifically with Poitras, I guess it is. I like what he's saying about that truth is everywhere, and it makes think, because I know that those terms, omnipotent, omnipresent and stuff, is often referred to when it's referring to God. So I guess it's showing that God is truth.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's saying that this pattern is pointing to something much greater going on, which is it's pointing to the goodness of God, it's pointing to the truths of God, and therefore we can have faith and belief because of these truths. So the Fibonacci sequence is all around us. And so we can see in the patterns the way rabbit breeding, in spirals, in plants, all point to there's more structure to the universe than we imagine. And it was used by Da Vinci in art, and it was also used in architecture by the ancient Greeks. So there's much, much more going on than people are commonly aware of. Just as a quick reminder of the branches of mathematics, we've looked at number, which adds and subtracts numbers like 1, 2, or breaks them into parts like half and a quarter. These are the natural numbers. Why do we sometimes use algebra like A and B? Can I briefly ask Stephanie, any thoughts why in maths they would sometimes use the letters? So if we want to look at the size of something and we want the length times the breadth, why do we use L times B or A times B rather than the number 2 times 3 or 3 times 4? Any thoughts, Stephanie? And it's called algebra.
Yeah, look, it's been a while since I've done algebra, but it's kind of like a placeholder, so you can substitute in the numbers for a variety of different questions, because the theory or the rule of that, what are they called, of that equation should apply to every circumstance if it fits into the parameters.
Yeah, so that's so well said. So it's a theory or rule that applies to every circumstance, and that's what algebra is about. And then if you use Excel spreadsheets, you can type in numbers and answers can pop out because they're using these rules that have been placed there. So algebra has been used by civilizations since ancient Rome and Greece and Egypt, and through geometry is where we apply numbers to measuring things on the earth, shapes and spaces, and engineering. Sets is where we group things together, like a cricket team. There'll be the number of people, so you group things together. Trigonometry is where we develop the geometry and triangles further, and we can work out what angles are. And that when you go orienteering or traveling, you can use that out, or you can have your electronic device can do that for you. Probability is about chance, which may exist, or it may be that we simply don't know all that is there. And then calculus looks at the way things change. So it can be useful. If I had a cake here, we could chop a cake up into 12 parts, and you can see that length times breadth equals area. Notice that length and breadth are quite different concepts to area. So length, 3 centimeters, breadth, 4 centimeters. These centimeters are very different to the square centimeters. So I think it's important to remind students of the difference of area to length. So if you're putting icing on top of the cake, then just having a little line, which has got next to no icing along the line compared to the icing area, is going to be very different. If you want to work out the area of a triangle, then it makes sense that it's half of the rectangle. Interestingly, if we make other triangles, they'll also be half of the rectangle. So if the size of a rectangle is length times breadth, if you halve it, you'll get the size of a triangle. When it comes to a circle, things are a little more complex. If you want to know the distance around the outside of a circle, we could do it with a piece of string. Josie, what do we call the word for the distance around the outside of a circle?
Circumference.
Very good, 10 out of 10. And so distance around the outside is called circumference, and then diameter is the distance across. And then if you're going to draw a circle from the center of the outside, that's called the radius. Now, pi, this funny squiggling sign here, is the relationship between diameter and circumference. So if you were to take the diameter, so if we drew a circle, and we could do this activities with the children, and if you get a piece of string, put the string across the middle, the diameter, and if you go around the outside with the circumference, you'll find it is just over 3. So the circumference is just over 3 times the diameter. Or if you're talking about the radius, then 2 times the radius there. Now, this is constant for all circles. Again, it's fascinating why it doesn't change. And so a circle of radius 3, diameter 6, 3.14, just over 3 times would give us 18.84 would be the area. So if you're doing this in a class, I think it would be good before giving the students the answer. If you've got an hour, I would spend half an hour getting them to play around with bits of string, and I would say, what is the relationship between the radius, the diameter, and the distance around the outside? And they'd say it's just over 3. And then finally, after half an hour, you'd say that's we have this magic number we call pi that we use. You could also do similar with a ruler, and that would be teaching them rule and distance ways of doing things as well. So that would be another useful way to do it. You could do it with various plates that you could bring in, and you could try and work out using a piece of string or a ruler, what's the relationship between the distance across. And you could then even design a billy cart, make wheels out of it, design a toy, make wheels out of it, and you could relate the distance around the outside, and you go further, you calculate how far things travel. You could also do a bit of cooking, distance around the outside. So if you're going to put some fancy icing around the outside, how long will it be? So there's practical ways that you could make it work. If you want to be more complex, if you want to work out the area of a circle, if you take a very, very small piece and keep chopping up the circle, and then if you take all these pieces and putting them together, you can see it's a bit like a triangle from the smallest piece to the outside circumference. So it will be half of the longest piece, which is 2 pi r. So times the distance from the middle to the outside, which will be r. So it'll be half of 2 pi r squared, which will be pi r squared. So that's one way to do it. Another way, if you want to do a more advanced lesson, would be to chop the circle up into pieces. So here's the circumference across one. We're chopping it in half because we're making 2 lots of triangles, chopping it up into pieces. So that's a more advanced way of working out the area. So one of the things that we see here is that it's good to be inquiry based. It's good to use practical examples. It's good to show the relevance, such as food or eating, etc. We mentioned before about areas that you could use maths in, and we've said in finance, so you could talk about buying things. We've said a car, you could talk about buying a car, etc. So these are ways that we can help reduce maths anxiety. Can I ask a few people now, what are ways in which we could reduce maths anxiety? Jasmine, how would you reduce maths anxiety? And then I'll ask Ruben.
I think maths anxiety typically comes from a place of not being able to understand it. Like I know a lot of my siblings, they love basically every subject but maths, which is because they just haven't been able to understand some of the primary concepts, even from primary school into high school. And it kind of just, it sets them up to not feel confident about it. And especially if you have a teacher that isn't able to acknowledge that. So reducing that, I think, is dealing with those issues and dealing with the foundations of stuff that they don't understand. And then that, I think, would reduce maths anxiety.
Yeah, so good. So Ruben and then Josiah, how would you reduce maths anxiety?
I definitely think, coming alongside students and understanding if they are struggling. So I know that in the past when I've found that I'm getting the maths anxiety and stuff, it always helped when the teacher came down, sat beside me and just went, okay, we're going to sit here until you work it out. And then eventually you just have this click moment and that it resolves. I guess. That's very specific to when it's like at a certain time when you get it. It doesn't account for generalized anxiety with maths, but
Yeah.
especially if it's just one concept that you don't understand.
Yep. So good. And then Josiah and then Stephanie.
It is.
Howdy, I'm using Gabby's mic so we don't get a lovely feedback loop. I would agree largely with what's been said. I think the best thing is really coming beside the student and giving them, or even like a small group, and giving them more individual attention, giving them space to ask questions, and then kind of building their way up brick by brick with simple questions leading to more complex structures and ideas.
Certainly, they're great ideas, small groups and then simple questions there. So that's great. Stephanie, how would you reduce maths anxiety?
Yeah, I liked that point about starting with the simple stuff and then building up. Because I guess instead of just going into like the really hard new work that you're introducing, kind of would give the students a win to start with. Which, starts the lesson off on a good foot. In some of the classes that I've been in, the teachers will use like the whiteboard. So they'll get the kids to write the answers on the whiteboards and then just show it to the teacher. So instead of, having to put your hand up to answer a question, the teacher can see it, but because all the kids are facing the front and showing the board, other kids can't see it. So if they make a mistake, it's not like broadcast to the whole class. And the teacher can just be like, oh, try again. And, I guess it stops the embarrassment or the anxiety about having to present an answer to the class.
And these days, of course, we also have YouTube. And so you might give some students a YouTube to watch explaining it. If you've got a lot of students, 25 students, it can be a lot of people to give one-on-one with them. But if you had a way of putting up a YouTube explanation. So there's all sorts of ways that we can give more time, get alongside the students there. So maths is an important tool in critical thinking. It enables us to describe with certainty, because there's a certainty about it there, the qualities and quantities involved in decision making. We can encourage students that if they could use maths, then they would get more certain results. We can encourage students that there's going to be applications. So I think real life examples, letting them know they'll do well in work, they'll do well in all sorts of areas of life. So what about taking a practical example? Going back to Josiah, if you were buying a car, Josiah, what would be some ways that you could show a student that it would be practical and useful to use maths in purchasing of a car?
Could you repeat the question, sorry?
So we're looking at using a practical example in maths, and this one's buying a car. What sort of maths would you use in buying a car?
Yeah, well, I'd begin with probably considering a loan scheme and looking at, well, it really depends on the car. If it's a new car, then I'd look at things like loan schemes and how they work and how much interest I end up paying and how soon I have to pay how much of it, which would be mathematical. And then I'd probably look at fuel efficiency, which is a ratio. I mean, if I wanted to, I could use pi to discern the circumference of the wheel, but I'm not going to do that. Yeah, those are my vibes.
Yeah. So certainly, I think there's things about the car, and you could even make it a project that they could think about overnight. It could have a bit of homework to it, and so they could talk about different brands, what different brands would do and how they work. So that's just one example. So mathematics increases our ability to investigate claims of truth. So you could talk about, people claim this is cheaper. The whole shopping centre, you could actually bring in examples and ask them, 2 kilograms of flour or sugar compared to 500 grams, which is the cheaper. And you can use maths in all sorts of areas. Now, maths can be used in deception and manipulation and self-deception, but maths can help people overcome deception, manipulation, and self-deception. What about maths and COVID? Any thoughts on how would maths help you understand whether you should get vaccinated or not, whether you should take risks or not? Any thoughts on maths and COVID? Gabrielle, your thoughts on whether maths helps you make health decisions like vaccination?
How did I know you were going to call on me, Dr. Sam? It was probably my face. I can't hide it. Look, I mean, we can look at the statistics on the success rate of the vaccination and how much it decreases your possibility of infection. Like, I know that I looked at a few statistics in regards to the different kinds of vaccinations to figure out which one I would get. We can also look at if you're vaccinated and, you know, if you're going to get it, are you going to transmit it to people who aren't vaccinated or are immunocompromised? And so you can look at statistics in all of that. You can look at the fatality rate. You can compare it to other viruses to see sort of how dangerous it is. There's lots you can look at. I just don't enjoy talking about COVID is all.
So maths comes into everyday decisions we're making each week, and one of the big decisions people have had to make. Spanish flu pandemic, interestingly, over 50 million died, more than in the World War I itself, in the year after World War I. So you can see COVID fatality rates have fallen from 17% to 5.8% as Chinese began to wrestle with it in other nations. And then its common rate before vaccination was about 2% of people who caught it. And the real problem was it would flood our hospitals and we wouldn't be able to treat all the people who came in. And so there were lots of ways they tried to slow down the spread of COVID. But once we got 2 shots in the booster, then it's down to 1 per 1,000 or 1.4 per 10,000. So except that runs out after 3 months. So let me know if you can think of health examples. I know one person who went to the doctor, and the doctor asked them to take some tablets health-wise because they had breast cancer and had the lump removed. And these tablets made them feel very sick. So they asked the doctor, should I keep taking the tablet or not? And so the doctor went over on his computer, typed into it, and it said, at the moment, you have an 87% chance of surviving. If you stop taking the tablet, you'll have an 86% chance of surviving. So you increase your chance of dying by 1% or 1 in 100. And this person then chose not to take the tablet. And so they have an 86% chance of surviving, which makes a 14% chance still of dying. That's it, been increased from 13% to 14%. But you can see how statistics tells people what the chances are of a person dying. Can anyone think of any health examples where you've used maths in health? Hand up if you can, or speak up. Stephanie and then Gabrielle.
Yeah, I use math all the time when I'm working as a nurse. So
wow.
Things like working out the average of the blood pressure, so the mean arterial pressure, and then drug calculations. Yeah, there's a lot it's a lot in our job.
Yeah. And do you find, Stephanie, that maths in general you're familiar with, or is it very specific? You've done general math studies, but now it's specific to the blood pressure, etc. as well, that you find it?
Yeah, yeah, I used to know a lot more maths during like high school.
Yeah.
But yeah, now it's quite specific. So I know the formulas required for various medication dosages and that sort of thing. And you know, that, yeah, it's very much a specific.
Yeah, and this reminds us that we can learn again the maths that we learnt in high school when we have specific needs for it in particular jobs. When our job changes, we may learn those. Gabrielle, you had some thoughts on health and application.
Sorry, was that me?
Yeah.
I'm not super comfortable talking about the situation, if that's all right. But I do have a lot of family who work in the medical field, and I know how that works for them, and I've heard them talk about it a lot. So it's just surrounding my life.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Anyone else? Well, that's so certainly COVID risks have been important when people make decisions. So thanks to maths, we can explain how things work. We can put up charts. We can make decisions. For instance, in the United States, 13% of women ladies will get breast cancer at some stage. So that's 1 in 8. So that encourages people to go and have a breast cancer test, and even higher chance if someone in your family has had breast cancer. And I know someone at the moment who's facing huge challenges because they left it a little bit longer. If you can get it treated early, then it's almost 100% curable. But if you leave it too long, then you have a major challenge that you face, and it can lead to people passing away. Cigarette smoking, 480,000 people in the USA die a year from cigarette smoking. 41,000 die from secondhand smoke exposure. They don't smoke, but they're around people who smoke. Exercise can lower your chance of premature death by 30%. On top of that, exercise reduces your risk of stroke and coronary heart disease, and you're 50% less likely to get diabetes, and 68% less likely if you fall to fracture a hip. So maths makes up a huge part of our everyday life, and then when we need it more, we can focus more on particular areas of maths. Pascal said you can even use maths as a reason to believe in God. Pascal said that the probability of God being there, let's say it's 50-50. The cost of believing in God, go to church occasionally, declare your faith in God, read the Bible a little bit, it's not highly expensive. The benefits of believing in God, if the 50-50 God is there, could be eternal life, could be life in this world, could be live a better life and make better decisions. The benefits, he said, are probability-wise so huge and the cost so low that Pascal said everyone should become Christians just because it has these benefits. Pascal was a follower of Fideism, which maintains that faith is independent of and superior to the natural world, but at the same time he argued that maths and the natural world gave some support to our faith in God. So maths has all of these many connections to many areas of life, both faith and practical. And maths can help you not to lose money. Maths can help you make money and do well. Maths can open up opportunities all around the world, and it can give you lots of opportunities. I met a girl who applied to study at Harvard, and she got in from New Zealand, and then she discovered that it would cost her $100,000 a year to go there. And she explained to them, even though they accepted $100,000 a year. So they did some maths calculations, and she had to submit maths calculations on how much her parents earned. And they said, that's okay. We'll pay everything plus your accommodation and everything. And she's now studying at Harvard. So maths can help you in your application, help you in job opportunities. You never know when maths can help you out. So maths is about logical thinking, 2 + 2 = 4, but it's a lot more than that. It's being able to not only do the arithmetic and solve the problems, it's a way of thinking. As we said when we're talking about spoon feeding, many schools and teachers emphasise the procedural side of maths. However, while learning by observing others is important, learning methods is important, and by practice this can become useful. Simply following mechanical repeated approaches certainly isn't all that maths is about. Maths is about discovery. It's a way of thinking. Maths relates to music. Maths relates to sport. Maths relates to economics. It relates to many other areas in life. And we could bring music and sport and guitars into a maths classroom, and we could show that it's relevant to many, many areas of life. In maths, we could spend longer talking about the problem, such as buying a car. We could spend longer talking about the problem. What are the chances of death from COVID? We could then spend longer talking about ways of gathering information, and we could include more sources of information. And then we could spend longer experimenting with ways of calculating areas before we go on. And we gave an example there of working out areas of a circle, and we said that we could have pies and wheels and other ways, bits of string, to make it more interesting. Maths also can include the imagination. That is, maths can be intuitive, and it can involve these different ways of understanding. And so rather than seeing maths as simply following what the teacher says, then we could also see maths as thinking about the question, wrestling with the question, and then working through different ways of engaging with the question. So can I get everyone to write down now, what are 2 or 3 things that have stood out to you today as we've looked at maths? What have you learnt in terms of what we've talked about? And also, we'll then go on to look at ways in which our teaching could be changed and transformed as a result of some of the things that we have looked at today. So, what stood out to you? What have you learnt? And then how can our teaching of maths be improved by considering some of the things we have discussed today? So we've covered quite a lot of different things, including both maths and critical thinking. That is, maths has an exactness about it that helps us to get things more certain. So if you've got maths and you can apply it, we've talked about maths and truth. We've talked about the big question is, do numbers and formulas exist? Are they real or made up in the mind of people? And we use that example of thinking of 2 + 2 = 4 and then printing it out and then handing it to people. And then we've also talked about maths and faith in God. And we've said that there are some parallels between maths and faith in God. Matilda, what stood out to you today? And then Aidan.
Hi, sorry, I literally only just got home from my train. So, what was the question? Sorry, sir?
So the question, what are some things that have stood out today from our class?
Well, I liked when you gave everybody an opportunity to talk about different ways that the maths anxiety affects a classroom, but then also ways that they could reduce that maths anxiety, because I actually had that a lot when I was a kid. And because I was homeschooled, my mum actually gave me so many opportunities to address that anxiety, and then maths became one of my top subjects. And so
Wow.
yeah, I really enjoyed hearing about those.
Yeah, so good, so cool. And then Aidan, and then Chloe. Aidan, what stood out to you today?
Mine was much the same. In the maths anxiety stuff, while I probably won't be explicitly teaching maths as a subject, even numeracy components, the stuff I teach, yeah, it was helpful to hear the anxiety around it and also how to relieve it.
And I was struck by that idea that if you give extra support, extra explanation, when students know something, then they will be a lot more confident. And so it's often that lack of knowledge, the feeling that they're a bit behind the field. It's a bit like being in a race and discovering that you're 10 metres behind everyone else in the race. It's an uncomfortable place to be. Whereas if you give them help, then they'll feel really confident when they're ahead. Yeah. Chloe, and then Josiah.
Yeah, I think like the maths anxiety thing was something that I found interesting, and just like reflecting on how we as teachers can sort of provide that support for students, and I guess just like thinking about the different learning styles and the ways that we can support them, like collaborative work and sort of grouping kids really intentionally together to maybe support the ones that are that struggle a little bit more. And that's something that because we get to go into the schools every week, that's something that I'm actually seeing and figuring out how that looks in the classroom, which is really helpful. And yeah, just like how much maths is in nature, and like the Fibonacci concept I found really interesting. Actually realizing just how much maths is in nature and in the world, and you kind of don't realize until you sort of do the study and figure it out.
So good. Josiah, what stood out to you?
Wait, am I on? Yep,
Yeah.
cool vibes. So my probably key takeaway from this lesson was the prominence of mathematics within creation, particularly the Fibonacci sequence. After we discussed that, I kind of went and did like some research and found that it's like in the spiral of hurricanes, the patterns of growth within tree branches, even the proportions of the human face, which is pretty remarkable. And then I was like, well, we can use this to explain the significance of studying maths to students. And we can also use it to incorporate Christ into mathematics lessons, which is a vibe.
So good. So it gives us confidence that God's got a big plan, and that as that plan unfolds, then we can have confidence that his plan in Christ too is going to unfold well. Jasmine and Shyla, what stood out to you?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I can't actually see. Do you want me to go? I'm going to go first. All right. Anyway, I really liked how you said, it was at the start of the second session, you said patterns in nature are pointing to something bigger going on. I thought that was really cool, and it was just a different way for me to understand like the Fibonacci sequence and everything else that kind of goes on in maths. I thought that was a cool point.
So good. Shyla?
I didn't actually really know that much about the Fibonacci sequence, but I had to do some Josiah investigating and go do my own little research session, because I'd heard of it in like high school science, but I hadn't like really looked at it in depth or understood like what it was actually saying or what it was about. The other thing was with math anxiety, like I feel like that was same as Tilly, really relevant to me, but I wasn't like anxious about maths, the subject, because I was actually really good at maths. I was just a slow processor. And so I had like, if I got called on to answer a question when we'd just gone through something on the board, I would freak out and be like, oh, I'm so bad at maths because I can't answer it like straight up. But if I had a worksheet and I got to go through it a couple of times, I would remember it weeks later and I'd be able to do it in an exam and I'd be good at it. Like I was really good at maths, but those like that anxiety of having to know something straight away and not having the time to process for me was always like put me back and made me feel like I wasn't good at maths, even though the marks I would get proved that I clearly was. And it's just that like being able to sit down with kids and like make them understand that everyone's brain works in different ways at different speeds, and like there's so many different ways you can explain it to help that one kid get that. And like obviously that's something that we'll all find in our classes. So
Yeah, so good. Shyla, your thoughts?
that was me.
Oh, sorry, Jasmine. Yep. Who's next?
I answered before Shyla.
Yeah, so we'll go Noah and then Gabrielle. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely the maths anxiety part stuck out to me, because when we were doing our intensives earlier this term, Cass Pendlebury, great lady, she was saying how when we have that, well, especially when our students have that fight or flight response, the amygdala is, producing that fear response, and they're not able to learn anything because they're constantly in that cycle. So if we can help break that down, then we can help our students learn, because if they're anxious in every lesson, they're not going to be able to learn because they're too worried about what's happening in their body is trying to prepare them to, run away or fight.
Yeah, so good. Such a great reminder, Noah, of if you've got other things going on, whether it be fear of maths or fear because someone's picking on you or whatever it is, then you won't be able to learn as well. Gabrielle, your thoughts on what stood out to you?
Yeah, I feel like a broken record at this point, but the thing about truth exists regardless of whether we know it or not. Like truth is going to be truth, whether you want to acknowledge it or you don't. And then the same thing about maths, the fact that like maths is in everything, whether you want to acknowledge the fact that it is or not, like it is, whether you're changing a tire on a car or you're sitting in a lecture, like there's going to be maths no matter what. And then something else that really stood out was something that Steph said about the whiteboards, using that in maths and not exposing kids in the moment and being like, oh, you've actually done it wrong, like try again. And instead just keeping that, like keeping trust between the teacher and the student and being like, I'm not gonna expose and embarrass you right now. Keep trying and you're gonna get there. And just having that that trust and pushing that.
And I like that thought, keep trying and you'll get there. It's a bit like a long walk or something. We're not immediately at the destination, and some people give the idea that maths, you immediately get to the destination, but this idea of keep trying and you will get there can be really reassuring to the student. Stephanie, then Ruben, and then Josie.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I also like the quote where chance is not chaos, but it's simply missing knowledge. I thought that was interesting. It just got me thinking that, maths is something created by God, and he's chosen what parts of it he'll reveal to us, which is cool. So not everything makes complete sense to us, but that's just because we don't have all the knowledge and we never will. So I just think that's cool.
And that's so applicable to probability and so applicable to many areas of life. And certainly Gödel's observations are that there's much that we don't know. Yeah. Ruben, what stood out?
Yeah, for me, it stood out in this second session talking about types of maths. So when we had like the arithmetic and you had algebra, calculus, all that. And it made me think about how all of them make us think critically, but in different ways. And it makes us approach different aspects of the world around us. So that was one of my points. The other one that stood out for me was the Fibonacci's ratio and how predominant it is in nature, and what that shows us that there must be created, just because it all makes sense as it's glued together with like the same binding, I guess. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. So the patterns all make sense. And Josie and then Shelley Ann.
I go with what Ruben said about the Fibonacci ratio. I just hadn't heard about it before. And then I think my other thing was that with the maths anxiety, I think it's such a big thing with maths, but I also think it's so applicable that that other students may feel that way with other subjects as well, not just maths. So just being aware that in like all of our different teaching, like I don't know what they call specifications or whatever, how you specialize, that's it. That we can support them in that, because they may also feel anxious in those subjects, not just maths.
And you've got embarrassment and safety and all sorts of areas that can be important. So important. Shelley Ann, what stood out to you today?
Oh, good morning. I just joined.
Yes, all right. So you're just catching up.
I wasn't sure what this group was and what timings you had.
Yep.
And I'm off sick, so I thought I'd see.
Yeah, no, that's all good. So drawing it all together, we've seen today that there are methods that you use in mathematics. We've also seen that there are patterns that we identify. And one of the challenges I think that we've also talked about today is how to make maths interesting. We've shown that you can, for Christians, show that it can be related to God. We've shown that different subjects can also be related. One of the major things that we've said is that there's two different approaches to maths. There is Plato's approach that says the numbers are real. And then the other approach by Aristotle says, hey, let's just talk about what we can observe. Can I ask Gabrielle and then Ruben, in going back to that discussion now and having had a little bit of time to think about, do you think Plato and the reality of numbers is sufficient to be convincing us? Or do you think Aristotle has some truth? It's just what we see out there. So Gabrielle and then Ruben, what are your thoughts on 2 + 2 = 4? We thought about it. Someone thinks about it in their mind, but it's does it exist before they even think about it in their mind? They print it on paper, give it to someone sees it. Gabrielle, then Ruben, what are your thoughts on this example?
I think there's merit in both theories, and I think that there's a level of truth in both of them. I agree that like 2 + 2 = 4 exists and existed before I thought about it. And there are babies being born today where 2 + 2 = 4 isn't necessarily truth for them. Like they don't know, but that fact still remains. So I think there's merit in both theories, but I don't think either of them are necessarily fully correct. I think we have to look at both of them through a biblical lens and see what God says about it, and then take our truth from that.
Yeah, we're talking about nursing before. In nursing, does nursing involve both observation and also that which is not observed so much in bigger realms, unseen, more abstract realms? Do you come across those sort of two different ways of knowing in nursing? Thoughts?
Sorry, are you asking me?
So which nurses have we got? Stephanie?
Yeah.
Is that right? Yep.
Glad it's not me.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. Most of nursing is based on evidence-based practice. So everything that we do has research backing it up, and they don't make changes to policy lightly. So it's quite, there's a lot of, on the flip side, there's a lot of wives' tales and that sort of thing that have come down through time that aren't evidence-based and are more wishy-washy and kind of not observable as truth or proven practice. But yeah, I think it's mostly based on observation and literature and data-based studies.
Yeah. And of course, the other side of it is that faith can be an important aspect in a hospital as well. At one hospital here, they got those who were willing to pray for people to wear a little badge, who were nurses, and it would have praying hands on it. And then they had a little bit of paper which said, if you would like to be prayed for by a nurse, then look for a nurse with that on. And they tried to separate out those who were keen and interested in bringing their spirituality and being prayed for. And they found that people who were prayed for did better. But again, that was probably evidence-based as well, in that, they're trying to look at what's working. And as you say, with certain herbs you take, some are evidence-based and some not. You've got to differentiate it there. So interesting examples. Ruben, what are your thoughts on the 2 + 2 = 4 existing and not existing?
I definitely think that if we're going to do something like 2 + 2 = 4, it's already existing before we see it, but before we're aware of it and it becomes something that we're aware of, we have to observe it. So I think we can't go as far to say it doesn't exist if we don't observe it, because that's just plain not true. So it has to be possible before, I guess. Just to make an observation that something has to happen.
And this can be said about Christian things as well. That is, we have a understanding, intuition that God exists. We pray, we have a sense that God reveals himself to us. We read the Bible, God reveals himself to us. So that too can be evidence-based. But at the same time, Martin Luther and Karl Barth would say there are times when you've got to take a faith step and trust in God that goes beyond that as well. Any closing thoughts on what things that we have looked at today? Hands up, anyone, or speak up, any who've got things that particularly stand out in terms of maths. I guess for me, it's a reminder of how certain maths is. If you can use maths and use evidence-based, then you can really know that your decision is going to be well-grounded, whether it be buying a car, whether it be a health decision. And working with students, it's fascinating when you work out the circumference of a circle, that it works out, it doesn't change. So maths has a reliability about it that points us to an author behind it. And we've looked at Fibonacci numbers, etc. They remind us that there appears to be a greater structure to the universe that points to God behind all these things. Thoughts on faith and God? So Jasmine and then Stephanie, what are your thoughts on maths? Does it increase our faith in God? Jasmine and then Stephanie.
I mean, yes, I think so. I think it can increase your faith in God. I think it just changes the lens in which you see the world personally, like using maths and having that as as you said before, with the patterns that lead to a higher power. I think it increases your faith in God just because as you look at the world, you go, wow, it's amazing. Like, how can it not, you know?
Yeah, so good, so amazing. And Stephanie, your thoughts on does maths increase our faith in God?
Yeah, I think it definitely can if you have a mindset to see God in maths. Like you said, he's got his fingerprint on it. So you can definitely see God in maths, and you know, the truth and the order of maths does point towards like a divine creator, which is really cool. But I also think that a lot of people would not see God in that because they're not looking for it. So I think some of the readings that we had, like the, I forget which ones, but some of the readings that I had really put it in a new framework for me. And I was like, oh, wow, I had no idea you could see God in maths. It was just like wild to me to read. But having read how people can kind of logically get to the conclusion of a creator God through maths is really, it was a new concept for me, which I'm excited to learn more about.
So good. So there are our thoughts for this week on maths, critical thinking, truth, faith in God. So if you have a bit of time, you might want to explore Fibonacci and some of these other areas further if you type that into Google. You could also include some of this in assignment 2, where you're thinking about the way we're brought up. Perhaps there are different ways in our modern world of seeing the world around us, and maths is one of those ways. Next week, we look at science as one of those ways that we see the world as well. With assignment 2 coming up, just a reminder, in 3 or 4 weeks, assignment 2, you're looking at your view of the world, and you're looking at what shaped your view of the world, and then how do you engage with people who have different views of the world. And one of the things we've touched on today is in education, to be aware that people have differences. Some work slowly plodding through, others can give quick answers. So with different backgrounds and differences in education, it's important that we're aware of difference, that we're open to difference, that we give people freedom, and we honor difference, that just as God values us from our Christian perspective, and you can include in assignment 2 quite a bit on your Christian perspective. And one of the challenges then is, how do you work with people who don't see this? And so with maths, as a Christian, you might see the patterns of God in maths, but how do you work with people who don't see that as well and honor them as well? Any thoughts as we're pulling it all together? Any questions at all that you might have? Otherwise, we'll see you next week for science and truth and faith in God. See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.